Yes, sorry.
That's so much better. Hello. I'm good. How are you? I'm just filled up my car with gas. 7 seconds.
So how about
One station that
I still have changed my
I want inflation's catching that. I want to replay it. You know, I figure it out. No, as I am. Yes. The whole thing. Oh, it's funny that you're here. You're number one. So thank you for thank you for what I thank you for the nice style. We have a ceremony. No matter. Playing back. Should be great here.
yeah.
Only
Yes.
Oh, yeah, I saw it before too.
Oh.
Yeah, I saw it in 2019.
Yeah.
I saw it the last before. In 2019. December weekend, I go to the cemetery and every weekend. No, second December. So that's happening. Fabulous then.
Yeah.
Good morning. Thank you for the package. Jeffrey, how did the poetry go the other day? Yeah, good. And the technology Jordan helped you with?
Perfect.
Great.
It was perfect, everything.
Good poems.
Difficult poems to have. The level I found challenging. The more I read it, the less I loved it.
Oh, seriously?
I'm sorry, it's just a very. But it's a wonderful thing. It's not easy to do. Like I thought of you, and how
Okay.
I prepare this every week. It's
The Hopkins is really quite rich, isn't
the
it?
Hopkins is rich, or maybe too rich.
Well, you know, there is something to that. A very sweet soccer story.
God's grandeur, and then read this. The different. I mean, he was much more pared down.
Hold up,
Well,
just what was saying. I see you. Nice to see you. I see you because I was online. Well,
use them all. With high frequency. Yes, it's true.
Isn't it though?
Oh. I never thought of it. He does get Toronto was almost
Just on and on and on.
but it works. Or the fifth, there's like 13 nice chords or whatever it is.
Oh, we go to such a shallow.
And you and Neil were able to,
We sorted it out.
good. Good morning. Shabbat shalom to everybody. So good to see you. So we have bagels, of course, but no coffee, as you've discovered. We had several people out this week with COVID, and that limited what we could do. So appreciate your helping yourself, and if you want a first or a second cup right in the middle of a sentence that I'm uttering, do it. I won't slow down, but do it. All right, very good. So just a quick announcement about tonight, which is Erev Shavuot. So we're having our annual Erev Shavuot study session starting at 7:30 right here. It's also going to be live streamed. So we're going to try to sit around a square table, a little more intimate, and I'll be facing the camera. So those who want to tune in live stream will, and those who are going to be here will as well. Let me just read to you what we're going to do. Biblical ethics in 3 character studies: Joseph's magnanimity, David's discernment, and Ruth's nobility. So the idea here, well, let me read a little bit of it here in the Temple Times. We automatically think of biblical ethics in terms of law and norms and imperatives, in terms of thou shalt and thou shalt not, but the Bible also conveys its understanding of ethics by means of descriptions of human behavior through stirring and memorable stories. So that's what we're going to do. And at the beginning, we'll look at a couple of attempts to understand this phenomenon. Piece by John Barton, Old Testament Ethics, a piece by Aviva Zornberg, which Doris very kindly sent to me a couple of months ago. Some wonderful things there. And then an excerpt from a really classic essay by Aharon Lichtenstein. Does the Jewish tradition recognize an ethics independent of halakha? Is there an ethics outside revelation, the revelation of law as expanded by the tradition? And this is an amazing essay for which I take just a paragraph or two just to see what he's up to, and then we'll turn to our study of these particular biblical figures. So come if you can. If you need to come late, do. If you need to leave early, do. You know my view of all of this. I love it when you're here for as long as you can be here. everybody is busy and at the end of a long day and so on. We'll talk a little bit about Shavuot tonight and then move to our topic. Okay, so blessing for the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We praise you, Lord our God, sovereign of the universe, who sanctifies us through God's commandments, enjoining upon us the obligation to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Amen. Okay, so we are now dealing in our final weeks before we stop for the summer. We'll go right through the end of June and then stop for a couple of months. We are finishing up our consideration this year of Immanuel Kant's 4 questions. What can I know? What ought I to do? For what can I hope? And what does it mean to be human? And we've done the first 3, and now we're looking at the last one. What can I know? And of course, knowledge is a very high thing to have. Belief is easier. Knowledge is harder. And that's what we're working on here. We're taking up the challenge, Kant's challenge, about what does the Bible say we can know. And we talked for the last couple of weeks about different issues. Can we know the events described by the Torah? That is, can we relate in terms of knowledge what is said and that which is directed by the text? The relationship between the text and reality outside the text, and we thought, at least provisionally, that that is a hard thing to do. One could modulate that claim a little bit by saying that as the biblical chronology unfolds, we begin to find references to the same episodes that the Bible refers to outside the Bible. So the Moabite stone of King Mesha does refer to Omri, one of the kings in ancient Israel. So there begins to be a convergence of events described and events having happened. But certainly in the Torah, we don't have any sure correspondence. So then we turn to something of a coherence theory of knowledge, and that is, how do the various elements of the text hold together? And the more coherence, the more complex. I use the metaphor of a universe. Think about that. I talked about that a little last night. When we look out onto the, as Kant calls it, the starry heavens, we think we're looking at elements of a universe. Think of the assumption that we're making, that all of those many elements out there are part of a whole universe and not multiverse. Of course, we've discovered, I suppose, many different universes, but we do use that term for the elements of our system, of our solar system. Can we talk about a universe that inhabits a story, a long story, an epic, the story of Joseph and his brothers, or David, or even Ruth, not nearly as long as the first 2, but still an extended and expanded story. And if the elements hold together, we might say we come to some knowledge about that which the story describes. I think another criterion about knowledge is whether or not it seems to us to be true. Does it correspond to our intuitions of things? Of course, that might be understood as personal knowledge and not knowledge per se, or even culturally dependent knowledge corresponds to our culture, and therefore we know it's small k, small no, and it wouldn't count, I think, as universal knowledge, transcultural. But how it strikes us, I think, is not an irrelevant factor in judging its at least power, if not knowledge. That's what we're working on now. So what I want to do today is to go back briefly to this sheet that Irv Kushner sent to me and from which I read last week. I'm just going to review it. Several of you also handed in to me some ideas of what biblical texts might be counted as knowledge or deeply powerful. And I want to go over those too, because I've read pretty carefully what you sent to me. And there's an interesting overlap among the four submissions, so to speak, that I got, which says something about maybe this group or a consensus, a cultural consensus among those of us, maybe even more than those of us. And I want to think about what biblical passages are referred to in your submissions as the things that are the most worth considering. So I want to look at that. But first, what I want to do is, I think on this question of knowledge and perhaps a criterion of how it strikes us is palpable in our first topic. So what Irv sent was that, as Irv puts it in a subtitle, the Bible, a textbook of human nature, what people are really like. What people are really like. The really, I think, is the important word here. We might not think so. We might have a rose-colored view of what it means to be human, but the Bible is not only telling us what we're like, but contrary to what we might want to think, the Bible is going to tell us what we are really like. Okay? So that in a certain sense, I'm inferring this, I'm not suggesting that Irv draws this conclusion, that the Bible may be considered something of a counterintuitive document. It is trying to correct some of our easy, not well thought through, not well considered views of things. Okay? So, and I would just want to summarize what Irv suggested and go on a little bit with a few additions of my own. So the story of Cain and Abel. Jealousy and murder. Two things that story features of the human condition. And this is not just a story along the way. This is a foundation story. This is the first episode outside the Garden of Eden. This is the first episode in the history of humankind. If we think of history as happening in time, whereas the Garden of Eden may be considered, at least potentially, out of time, they could have had eternal life by eating the tree of life and then trying the tree of knowledge. And so history doesn't happen in the Garden of Eden. History happens with the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. What's the first thing that happens? We have brothers sired by the mother of the two of them, and the first act is murder, which I think the Bible wants soberly to awaken us to the murderous tendencies that we human beings have. So some of these stories are not simply stories, they're attempting to tell us something fundamental about the human condition. Jealousy and murder. When God asks Adam, where are you? Adam equivocates. Who told you to do this? Well, the woman told me to do it. So a tendency to avoid or to shirk responsibility. Passing the buck. Abraham went down to Egypt and told Sarah, say you're my sister and not my wife. From which we might infer a willingness to sacrifice somebody else for the sake of our own benefit. Abraham sets Sarah up, makes her vulnerable in order to save his own skin. So my summaries are a bit unequivocal. The stories, I think, are a little more complex than this. After all, Abraham may have felt responsible for being the father of a great nation, and therefore, if he is killed off, maybe it's the end of the promise. So we might say that Abraham has a mixed motivation, but nevertheless, it doesn't look good for Abraham. And certainly Nachmanides in the Middle Ages criticizes Abraham for this move, saying he should have had more faith in God. So even the classical commentators find something problematic. And I think what Irv is suggesting, and from which I am drawing on, is that these stories are also representative stories. They're not just isolated narratives which may entertain and enlighten. They're telling us something about the human condition and how we human beings respond in it. Of course, the story of Jacob and Esau, and Jacob and Rebekah conspiring to fool Isaac into giving the blessing to Jacob and not to Esau, another element of or example of deception and deceit, and I add to that, indifference to the pain of others. Esau is bereaved on account of this. Isaac, when he learns of it, is also bereaved. But nevertheless, Rebekah and Jacob move on with this story in order to trap Isaac in giving the blessing which can't be revoked. Once I've done it, I can't take it back, right? It's I think, a powerful example of the way in which words once uttered. Oh, I'm so sorry I said that. Yeah, but what you said still resonates in some way. Thank you for taking it back, but that was your first impulse to say it. Isn't it true that even if I say something, which I've done, that I regret right away, I have exposed some feeling that has circumvented my censor. And even though I genuinely want to take it back, a word spoken can't fully be revoked. And that's what Isaac says here. Indifference to the pain of others. And the story of Dinah, how when a person, a Shechemite, wants to marry Dinah, her brothers say, yes, you can marry Dinah as long as you circumcise yourselves. And they do. And while they're convalescing, they're slaughtered by Jacob's sons. And Jacob is entirely enraged. Look what you're doing to me. And so once again, the murderous tendency, indifference to the pain of others, they take plunder, and so on. So these are very telling stories from the Bible about our proclivity to do the wrong thing, to try to cover it up, to expose others to pain. Let me just point, if you have your Bibles, to a couple of parallel passages, which I find and always have very revealing. So I want to go first of all to the book of Genesis, chapter 6. Genesis chapter 6, verse 5. Now remember, over the preceding chapters, things have gotten worse and worse. And so God, let me put it in this way, it comes to a recognition that the experiment has failed and that human beings really have to be destroyed, and God's going to try another way. Maybe another way to have partners in the created universe. It's one of the dilemmas of being the only God. You're alone. You're lonely. So verse 5 of chapter 6, the Lord saw how great was man's wickedness on earth. Notice how God arrived at that conclusion in the first 5 chapters of the story. and how every plan devised by his mind was nothing but evil all the time. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on earth, and his heart was saddened. And the Lord said, I will blot out from the earth the men whom I created, together with the beasts and so on. Let's forget that issue of the beasts. Why do they deserve to die? And let's just focus on the main thing here, at least what I'm taking to be the main thing. So God is fed up and is going to end the experiment on the basis of the things we have already noticed about human behavior in these first episodes leading up to this point. Then we have the call of Noah, we have the flood, Noah makes it to the other side, the process continues, and then if we look at chapter 8, verse 20, God's judgment after the flood. Then Noah built an ark to the Lord, taking every clean animal and every clean bird, and he offered burnt offerings on the altar. The Lord smelled the pleasing odor, and God said to himself, never again will I doom the earth because of man, since his devisings are evil from his youth. Notice that phrase, his devisings are evil from his youth, is the same phrase used both in chapter 6, verse 5, and here at the end. In other words, on the same assumption, a sober understanding of who we human beings are, God arrives at opposite conclusions. At the beginning, I'm going to destroy them. At the end, I'm not going to destroy them. The assumption remains that we human beings are deeply problematic creatures. The question is God now going to find another way? Or does God recognize, maybe in God's desperation, that he's stuck with these creatures, human beings, and he's decided to be a bit more, what's the word here, patient or experimental. So I think in a very powerful way, these complementary passages clinch the idea that we human beings are deeply problematic and that some antidote needs to be introduced in order to soften, weaken, eliminate, displace who we fundamentally are. And this leads me to Irv's final paragraph. I like these examples, Irv says, because these examples underscore the challenges that are confronted by the people who structure societies. Challenges. This is a challenge. The ancient Hebrews are an example. How can we organize things in the face of the perversity of human nature so that there is a modicum of tranquility and stability? The key word here is how. What is the antidote? What is the adequate response or the attempted response? Irv suggests the God abstraction is one way. Okay? So the Bible, let's think of the Bible as literature now. And the biblical author, having established a very strong premise that we human beings are what we are, and therefore there's always going to be disequilibrium, if not worse, entering into any attempt at social, political, economic organization. How can we minimize the inevitable disequilibrium? So we're in search, the biblical author is in search of an answer to this question. Irv speculates that one answer which the biblical author has come up with is God. God is the biblical author's experiment with how do we deal with the centrifugal forces that are always at work. Don't you like that? I mean, Perhaps I've elaborated this further than Irvis wants to go, but I think it's a very interesting, let's call it hypothesis. What's another possible hypothesis? Let's talk about that for a second. What else could a creative author come up with as an antidote to the perversity, if that's not too strong, of the human condition, where we're constantly, what does Hobbes say? Life is solitary, nasty, mean, brutish, and short, something like that. This is it. And what's Hobbes's answer? An absolute monarch. We make a social contract. Together we put in place the monarch. John Locke goes just that far, but John Locke's answer is, since we made the contract, we can break the contract and start again. Hobbes does not say that. Once we've established an absolute monarch, we're stuck with it. We can't take it back. That's Hobbes's antidote to the human condition. What else? What other possibilities are there? Doris?
I read Herb's list.
Yes.
And starting with the first, Adam and Eve, well, anyway, I propose hope in the anthropology that Herb presents. There's hope in every situation. Adam and Eve beget 2 sons. One is a murderer, but they have another baby. Now, they have to be not thinking, oh good, we'll have another murderer in the family, right? They're not thinking that. They're hoping things will be different.
Okay.
Isaac and Esau. It starts badly, but they're reconciled. There's hope. So somehow, in the way God has made up the person from the get-go, there's hope.
Yeah.
That the events of human life, even when they turn out badly, are not beyond repair.
That's great. Another way of saying it is life can always go on. Would you agree with that? Would you agree that that is a parallel way of saying it or not?
Well, more than that, it can go on reconciled.
So we can engage in repair, as Esau does with Jacob, and moreover, in anticipation of that possibility, we can hope for it and work toward it. Something like that?
Yeah, something like that.
Good. So Doris's idea is that, let me see if you accept this. We are twofold human beings. We can sin grievously, we can create a lot of problems for one another, create a lot of pain, but we also can move in the other direction. So what human beings are cannot be embraced by one view of who we are. We always need two. Let me try to illustrate that with some passages. So Doris has put it in terms of hope, which I think is great. And remember, that's one of Kant's 4 questions. Though Kant may have wanted to think of those two things together, who are we as human beings? Kant said, I'm afraid we're opening up the really problematic part of us. Let me introduce another question into my 4 questions. For what can we hope? Which automatically can be seen as, unless the hope is futile, here's what I hope for. that one day I can draw a four-sided triangle. Now, if that's what I hope for, lots of luck to me. Hope, in order to have some power, has to be realistic. It has to work within certain boundaries. I can't hope for everything. I think I'll jump off that building because I see the birds flying. I want to fly too. That's hope, all right, but it's foolish hope. So one has to also take into account, when one thinks about hope, what are the boundaries of the human condition? What is it that we can do? And within that, for what can we hope? So I want to turn now to a couple of passages which illustrate not just our capacity for hope, but our capacity to do a variety of other good things as well. So, first of all, Genesis 18. We know this passage. We keep coming back to it. Over the years, I've given short classes on the 6 most important chapters in the Bible. I mean, what a foolish thing to do is that, but I do it anyway. And chapter 18 of Genesis is one of those chapters. And it's divided into 2 sections: Abraham's hospitality and Abraham's, let's call it, argument with God. Let's just read a little of chapter 18. So the Lord appeared to him in the terebinths of Mamre. He was sitting at the entrance of the tent as the day grew hot. Looking up, he saw 3 men standing near him. As soon as he saw them, he ran from the entrance of the tent to greet them. And bowing to the ground, he said, "My lords, if it please you, do not go on past your servant." So Abraham does 2 things here. He welcomes the strangers, and he does it with alacrity. He runs. So, and over again, this passage points to running. Running is not just an action, it's an attitude, right? So what the passage has managed to accomplish is not only the deed of hospitality, but the attitude that underlines it at its best. My lords, if it please you, do not go on past your servant. Verse 4, let a little water be brought, bathe your feet and recline under a tree. Notice the word little, let a little water be brought. And let me fetch a morsel of bread that you may refresh yourself, a morsel of bread. Then go on, seeing that you have come your servant's way. And they say, do what you've said. Abraham hastened to the tent of Sarah, and he said, quick, 3 seahs of flour, knead and make cakes. He ran to the herd, took a calf tender and choice. Notice he promised little. A little bit of water, a morsel of bread, and he delivers a feast. Promise little, deliver much. Gave it to the servant boy who hastened to prepare it, and so on. So this is hospitality as an action, which I think we would agree is in some sense sufficient. If somebody comes to my door and they're hungry, and I don't want to, in my heart of hearts, bother myself with it or interrupt my day, but nevertheless I invite them in and give them something to eat, that's good enough in a way. It's helping them. We say this about tzedakah as well. You know, Maimonides' 8 steps of tzedakah. And the lowest is to give grudgingly. But notice that's included in Maimonides' 8 kinds of tzedakah. It's still tzedakah, even though my motivation is not pure. So that, we place a high premium on motivation, but also there is the importance of the act, even if I can't bring myself to mean it. Here, Abraham also means it. So here's the topic that we're working on now. Yes, indeed, we human beings can do very, very perverse things to one another. But we also can do very, very good things to one another. There is within the human spirit. So when Irv says here, what's the way back? The God abstraction is one way. And I think that's a powerful idea. Another way is to recognize the generosity, the strength for good inherent in the human spirit as well. And that's what we're working on now. Not to deny the God hypothesis, not to deny the power of hope, which may be a part of this capacity of us human beings to do good. Let's just look at the second half of chapter 18, verse 16. The men set out from there and looked down towards Sodom, Abraham walking with them to see them off. Now the Lord had said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? Since Abraham is to become a great and populous nation, and all the nations of the earth are to bless themselves by him." Blessing is possible, and Abraham is to be a vehicle of the blessing. I think by implication, Abraham's descendants are to be a blessing. We don't need to focus on Abraham and Abraham's descendants to recognize an anthropological vision here. By that I mean a vision about what human beings can do. And we are able to bring blessing to one another, if one wants to see this as a kind of representative story. After all, this story just on its face is not just about Abraham, it's about Abraham and his descendants, for whom Abraham needs to be a teacher. For I've singled him out, verse 19, that he may instruct his children and his posterity to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is just and right, in order that the Lord may bring about for Abraham what he has promised him. Notice how loaded this little narrative is. We have the capacity to do the right thing, to think about and to try to implement justice. And the Lord said, "The outrage of Sodom and Gomorrah is so great," and so on. "I'll go down and see," and so on. Verse 22, the men went on from there to Sodom while Abraham remained standing before the Lord. Abraham came forward and said, "Will you sweep away the innocent along with the guilty?" The beginning of Abraham's challenge of God. Whether God has invited Abraham to challenge him, or whether Abraham, out of his own inner resources, decided to challenge him, what we have here is a kind of Promethean individual without Prometheus. Prometheus steals a fire from the gods and gives it to human beings, okay? So that we gain, according to this legend, the rudiments of culture, fire, as a result of theft. Abraham here is challenging God. That's the Promethean element, without stealing. God seems to embrace and accept this. So that, don't we find something else here? The concern for, the passion for justice that Abraham is willing to promote even against God, even taking God's plan on. So don't you think that chapter 18 gives us another side of the human condition? That's the whole idea here. Let's look at chapter 24. Chapter 24 deals with Abraham sending his assistant north to get a wife for his son. And so the story unfolds. I want to start with verse 10. Then the servant took 10 of his master's camels and set out, taking with him all the bounty of his master, and he made his way to Aram Naharaim, the city of Nahor. He made the camels kneel down by the well outside the city at evening time, the time when women come out to draw water, and he said, this is why I'm citing this passage, "O Lord God of my master Abraham, grant me good fortune this day, and deal graciously with my master Abraham." So let's think about this just for a second. Here is this lone individual leaving home, going into a foreign territory, possibly being thereby vulnerable, and he persists in his mission to find a son for his master out of loyalty. O Lord God of my master Abraham, grant me good fortune this day, and deal graciously with my master Abraham. Here I stand by the spring as the daughters of the townsmen come out to draw water. Let the maiden to whom I say, please lower your jar that I may drink, and who replies, drink, and I will also water your camels. I mean, we could focus on Rebekah here as well, couldn't we? Let her be the one whom you have decreed for your servant Isaac. Therefore I shall know that you have dealt graciously with my master. He had scarcely finished speaking, and here she comes. It's a lovely move by the author, isn't it? And then at the end of this, verse 21, he reflects on what has just happened. The man, meanwhile, stood gazing at her, silently wondering whether the Lord had made his errand successful or not. So that this assistant, never named Eliezer, you remember in chapter 15, Abraham's assistant is Eliezer. We might infer that it's still Eliezer, but it's not stipulated as such. He also has the capacity to express awe at what is unfolding. Let's put it this way. The appearance of the uncanny. How plausible is it that here he is on this mission? He doesn't know where he's going. He prays for this benevolent woman. Here she comes. And not only does she do what he hopes, she goes beyond it. Let me do your camels as well. And she runs, by the way. Verse 20, quickly emptying her jar into the trough, she ran back to the well to draw, and so on. Here is this foreigner, well, she's a member of Abraham's extended family, acting Abrahamically. She's running. She too has the strong desire to do the right thing. I find this quite stunning. We have two very strong views of what it means to be human. Evil and good, perverse and extremely good. Whatever is worse than perversity, its complement is not only extremely good, but doing it from proper and intense motivation, meaning it. I hope I do a lot of good things during the day. I don't know that my motivation is always pure, but still they're good things. It's good to do good things. It's even better, though I take it rarer, to do it with the intensity of positive emotion. Here we see both, what human beings are capable of. Let's look at Exodus chapter 1. Here we have the story of the midwives. So the Egyptians are out to oppress the Israelites, and they move from one thing to another, and now they want to kill the males. Verse 15, the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives. This is ambiguous. Are they the midwives of the Hebrews, namely Egyptians, or the Hebrew midwives, namely Hebrews? And the commentators do say both, collectively. Some say one, some say the other. I like to assume, because I like the implication of assuming it, that they're Egyptians. Maybe they are Egyptians. I mean, who else would the Pharaoh put in charge of this task? I mean, the Hebrew midwives aren't going to facilitate it, so they're going to be his people, the Egyptians. So the Egyptian midwives are the ones he would appoint. That's just a chain of reasoning that may be flawed. I'm not betting the house on it. The king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, the other Puah. Unfortunately for my hypothesis, Shiphrah and Puah are Hebrew words. Saying, when you deliver the Hebrew women, look at the birth stool. If it is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live. The midwives, fearing God, did not do as the king of Egypt had told them. The midwives, all the more so if they're Egyptian, revert to conscience. Nahum Sarna, the Bible scholar, says fearing God is an expression of conscience. Okay? So out of their own inner capacity to do the right thing, I might say without full evidence, without having been commanded to do so, we don't get any evidence that they learned thou shalt not murder. They know this out of their own human resources. Did not do as the king of Egypt had told them. Let the boys live. Okay. Now they set themselves up for rebuke and maybe worse. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing, letting the boys live? And the midwives, I'll put parenthetically, quick thinkers that they are, under a great deal of pressure, said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They are vigorous. Before the midwife can come to them, they've given birth. We didn't do this. The Hebrew women are strong. I mean, they throw in a gratuitous compliment about the Hebrew women. But in any event, we might infer they're very quick thinking. They're resolute in their decision. They're not going to equivocate. And God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and increased greatly. Okay, let's just look finally way ahead to Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 6. So this is Isaiah's call vision, so to speak, his call to be a prophet. Somebody have the page in the JPS?
29.
Which one? What?
629.
629. In the year that King Uzziah died, that's Isaiah, I beheld my Lord seated on a high and lofty throne, and the skirts of his robe filled the temple. Just as an aside, this shows us what Isaiah's social position is in this society. He's something of a priest. He's something of the elite. He works in the temple. Seraphs stood in attendance on him. Each of them had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and 2 he covered his legs. With 2 he would fly. And one would call to the other, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. His presence fills all the earth, right? From which we get the Kedusha line in the prayer book. The doorposts would shake at the sound of the one who called, and the house kept filling with smoke. I cried, woe is me, I am lost, for I'm a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. Self-awareness, humility. I'm in a situation that is too grand for me. Yet my own eyes have beheld the King, Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphs flew over to me with a live coal, which he had taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. He touched it to my lips and declared. Okay, so, I mean, it's obvious, but worth mentioning. What is being sanctified here is the mouth of the prophet. That's the central organ of prophecy, speaking. And touching with the hot coals turns them from just a physical feature to now an instrument of God. So it's a very dramatic call narrative. What's being called and sanctified here is Isaiah's instrumentality. He touched it to my lips and declared, now this has touched your lips, your guilt shall depart, and your sin be purged. Then I heard the voice of my Lord saying, whom shall I send? Who will go for us? And I said, here I am, send me. So he moves from being a person of unclean lips, acknowledging his limitations, to having a conversion experience, I might say, and he goes with it. He owns up to it. Now I recognize that who I am has changed, and I embrace it. Who shall I send? Send me. In the sentiment in verse 5, I'm a person of unclean lips, he never would have said, send me. So he recognizes the import of what has happened to him. And he said, verse 9, go say to the people, hear indeed, but do not understand. See indeed, but do not grasp. Dull that people's mind. It's a strange mission. Speak to them, but they're not going to understand. But speak to them anyway. It looks like things have gotten so bad that the people are not even going to be able to heed the words of the prophet. Nevertheless, go talk to them. This is your mission, and so on. Verse 11, I asked, how long, my Lord? And he replied. Now, let's think of ourselves recognizing our vocation, whatever it might be, and then hearing something like the following, when I might ask, how long am I going to be committed to this? And here's the answer. Till the towns lay waste without inhabitants and houses without people, and the ground lies waste and desolate. For the Lord will banish the population, and deserted sites are many in the midst of the land. So go ahead and engage in your vocation. You're going to fail. They're not going to listen to you. Oh my gosh. If when I went to rabbinical school, somebody said to me, you got to do it, but you're not going to succeed. Would I have done it? Isaiah goes ahead and does it because he feels called by God. So from a human point of view, we might say this is foolish. But from a covenantal view, or a view of having been genuinely called, he's decided that the effect is really not the crucial thing here. What is crucial is obedience to one's call. Well, then, of course, verse 10 qualifies, verse 13. But while a 10th part yet remains in it, it shall repent. See, that's Doris's notion of hope here. Look, things are going to be grim. There's going to be a lot of punishment and so on. But repentance is on the horizon and hope for a new day emerges. It shall be ravaged like the terebinth and the oak, of which stumps are left even when they are felled. Its stump shall be a holy seed, right? Even when the tree is destroyed and the stump remains, the stump will, out of the stump, will grow something. And as improbable as it seems at the moment of destruction, there is hope that out of nothing shall come something. It's really quite an amazing chapter, isn't it? Chapter 6 of Isaiah. Stuart?
Compare this to the story of Jonah at Nineveh, where strangers, Ninevites, hear him preach and convert immediately.
Yeah. Yes. And why do you bring that up? Just as a parallel situation?
Yes.
One could take it even further, couldn't one? That The prophet doesn't even recognize the power of his own vocation. And the foreigners, strangers, excel in repentance. That's where we get the deepest repentance.
Compare that to the Mahler song.
Which song?
From the Youth's Magic Horn.
Okay.
It's Knappen Wunderhorn.
Yes.
Antonius,
The fish preacher.
yes,
Right.
preaches to the fishes who listen to him, agree with him, and go back into their own ways.
Yeah.
Their old ways.
Nice. That's great. Very good. Yeah. Okay, so here's the question that I want to ask. We have had, at least in the way I'm thinking about it, two very compelling pictures of what it means to be human. Out of the same source, out of the Bible. Okay? We didn't have to go to Dostoevsky to get this view. The Bible tells us in excruciating detail how malevolent is the human heart at its worst. But it also tells us how wondrous in positive terms is the human heart as well. So it gives us a complex picture of what it means to be human. Here's the question. Has the Bible in this regard given us knowledge? Do we now know this? What can I know, Kant asked. And what I can know is that human beings, according to the Bible, can sink to the lowest depths and rise to the greatest heights. This is not a speculation. I'm not asking you just to believe it. I'm asking you to know it. Do we? How many think we do? The Bible has given us knowledge here. It's not that we may not have known it before. We're just focusing on this text now to deal with Kant's questions. Of course the Bible tells us what ought I to do. Of course it tells us for what I can hope. Does it also give us knowledge? What can I know from the Bible? Hey, if I want to know something from Euclid, I can go to Euclidean geometry and know something. The question is, of course the Bible tells us what to believe in an equally complex way, but does it give us knowledge? Ben?
I look at this as God created us with free will, and in the hopes that we would use it wisely. He was very disappointed, and he gave us the Torah, or the Bible. And the Bible demonstrates to us what the consequences of our actions are, so that we should learn from them. Both good and bad. Those are the things that we can do. And throughout the whole story, we have choices. And he's illustrating these choices in different fashions.
You know, by the way,
That's the knowledge that he's giving us.
your summary of this was not, this is what the Bible says they do. You use the language of we, what we do, what we have capacity to do. So your presentation just now is a knowledge claim. The Bible tells us who we are. We have free will. That's not a guess. That's something the Bible makes known to us, and we can blow it, but we can also do very, very good things. So Bennett, I think, has answered in the affirmative. The Bible tells us what we know. How do you think you know that, Bennett?
I'm not saying that I know it. I'm saying that the Bible presents to us these examples.
Do you think what the Bible...
Take them and learn from them, then we know it.
Okay. Don't we know it before...
He's showing us the choices that we have with our free will in different situations.
What do you mean the choices we have? You're making a claim that we do
can
have...
help our neighbors, or we can take advantage of them.
And does the Bible tell us this?
Yes.
So the Bible tells us something that we know. How do we know it? How do you know this?
Because we have free will.
How do you know it?
Well, when you eat when you come to the fork in the road, you should take it.
Right. Quoting Yogi Berra in Torah Study. By the way, you know something about yoga, where the truth of that idea, because Yogi Berra lived, here's the street Yogi Berra lived on. There was a street that went here, then there was a fork in the road, and the fork led to a circle, and Yogi Berra lived at the top of the circle. So take it meant this way or that way. So Yogi Berra is not giving something that's just funny, but something that's true. Don't stop and wonder, just take one way. Okay, very good. I take it, Bennett, you know this because you've experienced yourself as having choices. Nothing is more known by you than you're not a robot, you're not an automaton, you make choices. So the foundation of our knowledge of what the Bible tells us is personal, experiential. Is that true? I wonder if somebody living in squalor and deep dependency at the lowest levels of the social and economic ladder think of themselves as free or more determined than free. Maybe they can decide what room to eat in. Don't you think it has something to do with one's social? That is, isn't it personal? That the palpability of our free will has something to do with our experience of our freedom. Harry?
I've been missing something here.
Good.
I think God tends to talk to us in terms of absolutes. Certain acts are benign, good, others are evil from God. What I don't hear is enough attention paid to ambivalence and behavior on the part of human beings depending on their particular status in life at the moment. That conditionally, you might want to call it, that human behavior is pretty much dependent on the particular emotions they experience at the moment,
Yeah.
which may vary one way or the other. They may be different tomorrow.
Yeah. And you don't find enough of that nuance, ambivalence.
That's right. Yeah. I think it's a more powerful thing than we may think.
Ambivalence.
Ambivalence.
You wish the Bible expressed or acknowledged more ambivalence than it does. It would have made what the Bible teaches you more powerful. Because I think Harry's making a good, I'm going to draw something that you're not explicitly saying, that we know that we human beings at our most human experience ambivalence. And if the text I'm reading doesn't account for this ambivalence, to that degree the text doesn't tell me who I am. It's more superficial than I would like it to be. It's an interesting comment. I want to read from one of the things that somebody gave to me in terms of this, what do you find in the Bible? And here's the opening of this statement, and I don't know who wrote this. If you're willing to tell me at some point, I'd love to know. The story of Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Ishmael, and Hagar holds multiple insights that make the Bible worth reading. these insights are contingent on having the willingness to look at different dimensions and to be willing to look beyond a purely religious or spiritual interpretation. I mean, what this person is suggesting here is that there is insight to be had into the depth of the biblical narrative, but we have to look for it because it doesn't always appear on the surface. Let's take as an example when God asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. So God says to Abraham, go to the land and I'll show you, and you shall take your son there and sacrifice him on an altar at the place where I shall point to when you get there. Vayesh came Abraham, and Abraham gets up early in the morning and he goes. So it looks like a parade example of what Harry is talking about. What do you mean? A father of a child is willing to, without questioning, without deep ambivalence, to follow. He's got two imperatives. One, just to assume the nature of the story. To respond to God's command, and to be a parent to his son. So that's the very definition of ambivalence. Two imperatives that go in a different direction. Why doesn't the Torah tell us that Abraham was ambivalent? If, as gruesome a story as that is, you'd be happier with it if there wasn't such a gap between the story's unwillingness to point to ambivalence and your recognition that life is filled with ambivalence. And if only the story made Abraham a little more ambivalent, it would be more credible to you. It would be truer, right? What's interesting is that, let's go back to chapter 22, is that the rabbis introduce ambivalence into a story that doesn't seem to have it. Chapter 22 of Genesis. Sometime afterward, God put Abraham to the test. He said to him, Abraham, and he answered, here I am. And he said, take your son, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. Now, what the rabbis recognize here is repetition. Take your son, take your favorite son. I'm just adding this word take. Take Isaac. Take the one whom you love. The rabbis suggest that this is just one side of a conversation. We have God's comments, but what we don't have is Abraham's responses to these comments. And what gives the rabbis the right to think of this as a suppressed conversation? Because there seem to be redundancies. So here's what the rabbis, how they flesh out, imagine a conversation. He said, take your son. I have two sons. Your favorite son. I favor both. Isaac. Only then does he say Isaac. So that Abraham is in a way trying to put God off. Take your son. Well, I have two sons. So you're being confusing to me. Your favored one. They're both favored because each one is from a wife of mine. So the rabbis introduce an ambivalence, if you'll agree that this reflects some ambivalence, into a story without it. Here's the inference I draw from this example. The rabbis agree with you that there ought to be much more ambivalence here than the Torah gives lip service to. Now, we need a lot of examples to see whether or not that's true. David just, when he sees Bathsheba, he sends his people to take her. Hey, David, is somebody else's, aren't you a little ambivalent? I know you covet her, but what about the problems with it? Doesn't seem to have any ambivalence about that. and he pays mightily for it. So Harry makes an interesting point. We might say that this twofoldness of human nature is expressed quite vividly by the Bible. And in that sense, it resonates with our sense of who we are. And to that degree, on that criterion, we know it. It's a little bit of a fragile knowing, but we know it. And yet, there's something the Bible leaves out, a component of what it means to be human, which diminishes the knowability, the recognizability of the characters as being mirrors of ourselves. I like that. Jeff?
In the prior chapter, when God says, cast out Ishmael,
Yes.
it says expressly that this distressed Abraham greatly.
Good.
So one could ask why he didn't say that about Isaac. My thought is that is it.
There you go. So Jeff has added an interesting complexity here. My generalization from what Jeff and Harry have said is that the Bible is going to illustrate both, and that we would need to look at a lot of passages to see finally what the Bible's view is. Does the Bible suggest that we are ambivalent creatures through a lot of Isaiah, I guess, was ambivalent there. Who am I? And then all of a sudden he's asserted I am. So it's an illustration of another way of doing something like this, and doing a word study. What does the word love mean to the biblical author? Well, the only way to get at that is to look at many, many, many examples in which the word love is used. And from that, and only from that, can we infer what the Bible's view of love is. And since we know there are several authors of biblical texts, it's likely not to be a simple matter to come to some decision. We'd probably not be able to reduce it to a simple definition. Chesed, and so on. Justice. We know there are different kinds of justice. Distributive justice, retributive justice, and so on. So I can't give you a definition of justice per se. Candy?
Would you say that to know something is not just, from what's written here, is not just one direction or another, but that action is necessary? Because to think about it, we always have three choices. We could go one way, we could go the other way, or we could do nothing.
Yes.
And so I would think that the commitment of action
Yes.
is an important part of our learning process so that we can know whatever the issue is.
So let me rephrase your point in terms of what Harry is saying and see if you accept it. One of the things the Bible is trying to get us to do, given that every decision moment can go in three ways, that the Bible is trying to get us both to acknowledge our ambivalence and to overcome it. Do you think that's true?
Yes.
Now, that would require a study, wouldn't it? To see whether we see that thought process.
Well, we most often see actions the way people have decided to move, as opposed to, we don't often see them just contemplating.
Well, that's a good point. But we could infer contemplation, couldn't we? So, for example, in the story of David and Jonathan, about Jonathan, it's claimed over and over again that he loved David. It never says that David loved him, from which we might infer that David was ambivalent about Jonathan because Jonathan helped him even against Jonathan's father. And therefore, David must have warmed to Jonathan. Why didn't the Bible therefore say that at least once that he loved Jonathan, from which we might infer ambivalence? And it stands to reason. There are plenty of reasons for loving him, but on the other hand, Jonathan is a descendant, the son of the king, and David wants to be king. so that he can't fully favor Jonathan. So we could infer, without the text even announcing it, that David is ambivalent. You think that's a fair line of reasoning? Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. Think of the great speech by Judah in the presence of Joseph. You know what? If you're going to keep Benjamin, our father will die immediately. Well, that is very heroic, isn't it? I mean, he's offering to put himself in the place of Benjamin. Let Benjamin go back, and I'll stay here as your prisoner forever. He's willing to do this. The basic reason is that he has empathy for his father. What will this do to Jacob? And yet, Jacob favored other sons other than Judah. So Judah must have ambivalent feelings about his father. What is stated and what is inferred. Let me ask this question. So I've just made a case for Judah's ambivalence. How many think the case has been made? How many don't? Okay, good. So, what's the problem with the case I've made? Maida?
Judah knows that he's not crying in his father's love. He knows that first it was Joseph and now it's Benjamin. So he knows that he is not that important to his father.
And he's okay with it.
Well, he's not okay with it, but he understands that this will kill his father if Benjamin's taken.
Okay, so the ambivalence that I am claiming for him isn't made strongly. It isn't a QED.
No.
Good. It's not a QED from other inferences from the biblical text. That's good. That's good. That's good. I guess I'm wondering a little bit about this issue of motivation in the Bible. The Bible rarely psychologizes. It's about action. I wonder, though, this is the sort of prima facie case I'm making, or hypothesis, that we can infer the inner life of individuals from how they act. And maybe we can, maybe we can't. Because, I mean, since it's an inference, it's not as solid as an action that is described. Abraham takes Isaac. What does that mean? He's not ambivalent about it. Well, the rabbis try to uncover some ambivalence. Isaac says, Father, here's the fire and the wood. Where's the lamb for the burnt offering? God will provide the lamb. Don't you think Isaac has a growing sense that it's him? But you could reject that inference. Enid?
It's always bothered me in this Makeda story. God has already told Abraham that his descendants are going to be as numerous as the stars. Isn't he thinking in one part, all right, this is what I have to go through, but I'm not really going to kill him because he represents my descendants.
My future. Yeah. You know, Kierkegaard in Fear and Trembling says that what we have here is a series of deep paradoxes, and that's the nature of faith. For Kierkegaard, as opposed to Kant has this book, Religion Within the Realm of Reason Alone, that religion can be seen as rational. For Kierkegaard, there's a level beyond reason, and that is the call to the individual, for which there may be a paradoxical context, but nevertheless, when God calls Abraham, he goes. Abraham doesn't think about this. That's Kierkegaard's view. Leo Strauss has this interesting moment in one of his essays where he's wondering, in terms of reason and revelation, which is the stronger? And at that moment, he says, let's think about it. And as soon as he says that, he says, we have already decided in terms of reason. Because if I'm going to think about it, that privilege is reason. For Kierkegaard, there's something above reason. You've given why didn't Abraham think about the issue that God said, through you all the nations of the earth, and Isaac's the only one, and therefore God can't possibly have meant this. I know it's not going to happen. See, for Kierkegaard, faith is irrational. It doesn't need to justify itself at the bar of reason. But when one is called, one responds. So, one could say this is Kierkegaard's book, Fear and Trembling, is an amazing reading of this story because he really tries to get to the nature of faith beyond reason. Yeah. Notice what Strauss is doing in that comment. Let's think about it. Privilege is reason. We can't do that. We have to see what the power of revelation is in its own terms, and not that it needs to be judged at the bar of rationality. Yeah. Okay, so, Gary.
It seems that Abraham took immediate action, took his son Isaac and went. But we don't know that. We don't know that he didn't stop and consider what it meant, not only to him and his wife personally, but to his son and his offspring.
Right.
The point that Enid is trying to make.
Why would you even introduce this into the conversation?
Because we just had a conversation about, plus and minus, about, whether there's a conviction one way or the other. I think that we don't really know what Abraham thought.
Here's my guess of why you introduced it. It's hard for you to believe that Abraham just went ahead and did this as the Bible says so. That's a pressure moment for you, and you can't believe that a father would do what the Bible in plain language says he did. He must have thought about it a bit. So, what's the origin of the must? The origin of the must is in the mind of the reader, you. And I think we all share this to some degree or another. How monstrous of a father, of a parent, when he hears a voice of God. I mean, why the heck didn't he tell Sarah? That's another question. Kierkegaard's answer is, once you get a call, it's not communicable to anybody else. It's a singularity. Of course, another reason for not telling Sarah is that he knows darn well Sarah's going to stop him. How do I know that? I don't know that, but I can't believe that Abraham did what he did without some compunction, and therefore he devised a plan. I'm not going to tell Sarah. She sleeps in late. I'm getting up early in the morning to take Isaac. So what's interesting is we readers have difficulty, maybe you don't accept the word difficulty, in reading some of these stories as they come, because they seem so monstrous. I mean, the book of Chronicles, when it talks about King David, says nothing about the Bathsheba story. Why? Because the author of Chronicles wants to clean up David's act and can't believe that a true story about David is as the book of Samuel says so. So even repeated stories interpose the need of the author or reader onto a story because the story is so pressure-packed. I can't help but thinking of Strauss's opera Electra here. Electra is just totally taken up with this compulsion to kill Clytemnestra. And the whole opera is just one compulsive act after another. Could this be how she spent her days? Is this it? Or has Strauss decided he's not going to let in some compunctions about this in order to give a pure picture of obsessiveness? So we might have been, well, Didn't she have a picnic now and then? I mean, didn't she watch a little TV and not be obsessed from dawn to dusk about killing her mother, which happens off stage? Wouldn't we want to see it on stage? Anyhow, Jeff.
Just 2 points. One, the story, without talking about ambivalence, has led us to talk for 20 minutes about ambivalence.
Yes.
And I think, in a way, the story is telling us something about ourselves by our reaction to it. Like, how could a father not have done this? Have done this. One other point is, it seems to me the Bible is filled with ambivalence.
Okay.
It takes 2 chapters for Moses to agree to be.
Good.
It goes on and on. God says, go talk to Pharaoh. I'm sorry, I can't do it. I can't speak well. He shows miracles to Moses, and then he sort of believes it, but he still pushes back. I think in the case of prophets, you tell me, I'm not no expert.
The reluctant
They do it
prophets,
reluctantly.
one after
Strikes
another.
me as ambivalence. It's true, you ultimately have to choose to do something or not do something. Once you've chosen, by definition, you've made a choice, but the attitude that leads you to that can be ambivalent.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's great. I think that's great. So that a broader look at the biblical narrative suggests a great deal of ambivalence, for which Harry, I can see, is cheering. Because the more ambivalence, no, I'm overstating it. If there's good ambivalence in the text, then the text is closer to who we are. You would say, so for Harry, here's the text and here's what I know about human nature. And the text that agree there's no ambivalence doesn't really capture what is human. And Jeff has now moved it closer to who we are, making it more credibly human. Would you go with that, Harry?
Well, yes, I'm thinking of Shakespeare, who was the master of expressing ambivalence, conditional thinking.
Yeah.
Just think of some of his soliloquies.
Yeah.
He grasped it early. I don't know that I see much evidence of that before Shakespeare.
Good.
There must have been some. I see it most deeply expressed.
You know, Harold Bloom has a book, Shakespeare, when he calls Shakespeare the one who has discovered what it means to be human, which has always struck me as wrong, but you're kind of making that claim, that Shakespeare knows something about us that previous authors didn't know.
To be or not to be, that is the question.
Sure, of course, yeah. So very nice. So here's what the Bible's view of human beings is. We have the capacity for deep malevolence, we have capacity for deep goodness, and we have the capacity to be ambivalent. That's a pretty rich picture, which we have drawn out together, right? And I think, Harry, your challenge has been a very good one. We've all felt the need, I did, Jeff did, maybe others did too, to try to find some ambivalence. Yeah, I'm sort of interested in why we needed to find it, because did we want the Bible's picture to be truer? Was it that, our need for the Bible to give of a fuller view, or did we just resist the claim there's no ambivalence? And this was a text issue and not so much a human nature issue. Irv?
Every author understands that there's a reader who brings something to his or her reading. They don't come with a blank slate. Every reader has had experience of interacting with human beings, understands what the spectrum of human behavior is, understands the ambivalence.
Yeah.
And when God says, take your son and go up and sacrifice him, and Abraham says, yes, I will. The reader immediately says, hey, wait a while now, it's not going to be that easy, man. He's got to go through do something while he's doing this. You know, it's too much to ask the Bible to spell everything out in detail. The reader himself is part of the story.
The subjective factor in reading.
Yeah.
Sure, sure,
Much
sure.
more compact than what I said.
What's that?
Much more compact than what I said.
Well, yeah, and a control on subjectivity, not a full control, is to do reading communally. So that when one of us says X, somebody else says, wait a minute, I don't think X is as strong as you've said. Well, I said about Gary that his reading of this was to some degree based on Gary's need. Gary's not the only one to read through need. And that's the subjective factor. But once Gary said it, we can all say, just as Harry raised that great point about ambivalence, and then we began to think about it, and I think we arrived at a balanced view here, maybe not as full as Shakespeare, you may be right about that, but nevertheless, communal reading puts a check on strong but maybe not fully adequate claims. That's what a good reading stands in need of. Strong claims. We make a strong claim and then we take it on. Is this true? Is Electra just obsessed? No. She sings a love song to Agamemnon. But I didn't think of that until I made a real strong claim. She's the definition of obsession. So it's the yes and the no that gets to some middle ground. Next week, what I want to do is look at some of the things that some of you handed in. Let me just read what one person did, just as a very provocative list. Here are the main stories. I'm saying something that this person didn't say quite so overtly, but here's this list. Creation, God's covenant with Abraham, the Exodus, Mount Sinai, and then comes a surprise to me, the book of Job. Two things out of Genesis, two things out of Exodus, and Job. So I think we would all agree that the two things out of Genesis, creation and the covenant, and the two things out of the Exodus and Sinai, these are in anybody's top 10. Job. So I think, let's think about this a little bit. Not at this moment, but how does Job fit into that picture if we're going to get the basic elements of the biblical story? I'm sorry?
Job is full of ambivalence.
Yeah. So let's think about it a little bit, and we'll also noted what others have written. Here's somebody else's: the creation story, the Exodus story, and the Sinai event. Psalms 23 and 150. David's story, the book of Isaiah. So the first two are what this other person did. I'm trying not to name names. Then the surprise of Psalms. I mean, certainly Psalm 23 belongs in your top 10, but is it on a par with, I found myself a little surprised. And 150, the last Psalm, David's story, the book of Isaiah. These are interesting lists. So this is something I want to take up. And if some of you haven't turned in your sense of it, do so. I think we'll spend some time now looking at your views of where the knowledge claims. Does the 23rd Psalm tell us something about ourselves? He prepares a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. That's pretty strong. Two things are said there. I have enemies and there's an antidote. The antidote comes from God. Yike. What a vision. Okay. All right, so next week and tonight, for those who are interested in studying some more interesting things. Shabbat Shalom. 7:30. In this room, yeah. I am running, so I've got
Okay,
to.
I was just going to say, I don't think ambivalence teaches us anything.
Doesn't it teach us that we are ambivalent? I mean, as a
Well,
description.
I mean, you're saying, what knowledge do we have?
Right.
And I'm saying that if you have a choice of act this way or act that way, what is the outcome? That teaches us something, those two outcomes.
That's true, but also the psychological fact that often we don't know which way to turn. And in that sense, the Bible
That didn't
captures.
teach us anything. We still don't know what's right and wrong.
No, but we do know that we're ambivalent, just as features of human nature.
Yeah, but I don't.
You'd like to
I don't-
move on?
I don't think that's knowledge. It's knowledge that we don't have knowledge, okay.
Well, that may be, and that also is true.
Yeah, we don't know everything. Well, but, I
You'd-
don't know if that advances anything.
You'd like to move on.
Knowledge to me is,
You want action
I've learned something
about the need to act.
as to, what I should be doing.
Yeah.
Roger, have you spoken?
Good.
Have you spoken to Carol in the last several days?
No, I have not. We have a date to have lunch. What's going on?
I'm really concerned.
Let's move away from the mic.
I got some more that I should go. So then I have to wash it. I might have more. I brought 6. 3 of them are back. Yes, I put my name on. Okay.
I've said to her for a long time, would it be good for you to go and to say Judson, or have some care?
She misses people.
I can sit soup with us and take it just to see if they had any.
Oh, what? She said, did they?
I see somebody got a look, but I explained one of them, she got her something. I said, is there somebody there?
Are you gonna go?
She said she was at the other end.
So I had a doctor's appointment and I changed it.
Ellen is gonna come, we're gonna come at 10.
I've seen that.
And we'll have to come at 10.
Okay.
And she's gonna bring somebody.
I would prefer nursing.
That's kind of wide. I didn't do any that wide.
And
There you go. Yeah. You've been working on the Ulysses thing with Nina a bit.
You know, a little bit. I've had, you probably threw all that stuff out when you wrote text.
yeah.
So that's what I'm telling you. I have a lot of, a couple of lines on the regular.
Free, I want to send the text
Then
out.
you need to glance.
I will start putting it on the screen, but I also.
Yes, that's the problem.
I agree as well.
You know, we thought that maybe just a little, so I don't know, Ellen doesn't know what to
But
give
some
her
of
or
them
not
feel
yet,
it is
so.
important to have it on the screen. I'll use my judgment along with that, because I tend to agree. We can't do it unless people have the text in front of them.
He asked me if she
Oh,
could
I'm
come,
intending about it,
so.
I'm not.
Yes, tell her yes. Should I
What,
ask?
what day is that?
I should ask him. I'll either text him.
Oh, it's the night, it's the night.
Yes.
And what time?
Just to be, yeah. I don't know if it's appropriate or not. She knows, I told her I don't know.
Is it earlier?
And I said, yeah.
I don't know
I said, don't.
I don't know either.
If,
Because I'm moving out of another house and I need to be there to clean things out and get things ready for sale.
Yeah,
So,
I'll see. I might just say that it's not appropriate. I'm not sure.
or later, or later in the day. Like 3 or 3:30.
I know.
Only because it gets really hot and I can't stay there that long and I need to be there early.
You could ask Cookie if she wants to pick your mom up instead of the 8.
No,
Not unless you make it after
I'm
11
not
o'clock.
gonna do that.
I'm gonna
Right.
relax, like,
Because then she won't stay with her the rest of the day, so, no.